Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the warm introduction. And I want to thank the University of Virginia's chapter of Phi Beta Kappa for the invitation to give this lecture and to meet with faculty and students. I also express my great gratitude to Professor Charles Matthews for organizing this visit. It's an honor to be with you all today. And that is the case despite the fact that the subject of my lecture, the humanism of evil, requires that we address issues that are normally and thankfully on the boundaries of our hearts and minds. I've been promised, given the scope of this topic, to limit that I have the next 6 hours to present this lecture, and then we'll have 2 hours of Q&A following. But let me begin by clarifying the framework of these reflections by noting some basic humanistic convictions and also the two kinds of evil that I want to explore, kinds of evils that have analogs in other people's positions. I might also add that given that I'm from Chicago and we are here in 75-degree weather in Virginia, I may have to remove my coat at some time. Do not be alarmed, I will be fine. Now, in what follows, I'm developing a specific conception of evil, freedom, and the self that bundled together help to explain what I mean by the humanism of evil. In making this argument, I'm mindful that for some people the real issue is not the humanism of evil, but rather the evil of humanism. Despite the temptation to do so, I will not address those critics who believe that humanism is essentially anti-religious, atheistic, and ecologically irresponsible. While those criticisms are right about some forms of humanism, I think a specific kind of humanism can withstand the criticisms and in fact show that the critics are rather wide of the mark, providing the defense of what I call theological humanism is best left to another time. Today, I want to humanize thinking about evil, and therefore I'm focusing on the kinds of evils done by human beings to human beings. Now, contemporary forms of humanism affirm at least three basic convictions, and for most of the lecture, I'm going to accept these as well. First, most contemporary humanists contend that the attack in the modern world on traditional ideas that morality is based in the will of God, or that there is some metaphysical foundations to morality, the attack has been decisively fatal for those beliefs. As Jonathan Glover forcefully puts it, quote, "One feature of our time is the fading of the moral law. The alternative is to keep ethics afloat without external support. If there is no external moral law, morality needs to be humanized, to be rooted in human needs and values." Now that too is going to be part of my argument, even if, as we'll see later, it is not the whole of my argument. The second, whatever one wants to say about humanism, at least it means this conviction: to protect and to promote the finite and inner-worldly goods of health, education, and sufficient wealth to sustain a decent human life in this world. In other words, humanists are committed to the flourishing of human life within, not against, other forms of life. And this is going to be important for my own argument as I try to specify what I mean by wickedness as one of the forms of evil. Third, humanists believe that while human beings share with other creatures a range of basic goods, we also, paradoxically, take a stand in relation to our finitude. In traditional terms, we're not only natural beings, but also moral and spiritual beings. And this is one reason that I will speak later about conscience and the monstrous as another form of evil, itself the destruction of human conscience. Now, linking these basic goods in the dynamics of conscience means that we can speak about evil as both understandable, that is, as the violation of basic human goods or wickedness, and somehow also as inexplicable, beyond rational comprehension, in the denial and self-violation of conscience, that is, the monstrous. The humanism of evil then entails two different but related kinds of evil, the wicked and the monstrous. Initially, I'm going to bracket theological and metaphysical backings for morality in this account of the humanism of evil. But at the end of these reflections, we'll see why we need to lift those brackets, despite what Glover held. And we'll see the reason why we need certain theological claims and even metaphysical proposition in our reflections on the forms of evil. Now, in order for you to have an image of evil as my reflections unfold, consider the following example taken from Jonathan Glover's book cited before, Humanity, A Moral History of the 20th Century. The text is a memo written in 1918 by Lenin about the suppression of an uprising and how it should be crushed. Part of the memo reads as follows. 1. Hang, and I mean hang, so that the people can see no less than 100 known kulaks, rich men, bloodsuckers. 2. Publish their names. 3. Take all their grain away from them. 4. Identify hostages. Do this so that for hundreds of miles around the people can see, tremble, know, and cry they are killing and will go on killing the blood-sucking kulaks. Yours, Lenin. Lenin helped to engineer the Soviet terror, but notice that the features mentioned in this brief memo are found in many, maybe most, forms of human evil. Horrific violence, publicity, economic deprivation, hostage-taking, and systematic, widespread, and public killing. The kulaks. Enough then by way of an introduction. Keep that image in mind. Let me now clarify the problems in thinking about evil. That is, to think about evil is necessarily an abstraction from the experience or depictions of evil, because we're trying to grasp it under some rational form, a form that oftentimes is lacking in our actual experience. So let's turn to thinking about evil. Reflection on evil done by human beings, that is moral evil, has taken different literary and linguistic forms, from symbolic and narrative discourse, like the biblical story of Cain and Abel, or Matthew's Gospel, or Sophocles' great drama Antigone, to metaphysical speculation, and from assertions about the unthinkable nature of evil by some Holocaust writers, to highly developed philosophical theodicies, but also from lament about evil suffered to the logic of retribution, and so justice, clemency, and mercy. The issues involved in trying to think about, explain, and understand evil are, then we have to admit, staggering, and they threaten reflection with endless frustration. The challenge to thinking about evil has been a dominant factor in Western thought and also in contemporary discourse, but within different registers of reflection. Classical Christian thinkers like St. Augustine and many others held that, properly speaking, evil has no being. Evil is the privation of whatever does have being, but itself is non-being, a kind of nothingness or abyss. Not only was this assertion made in order to ensure the goodness of God and God's creations, affirmation central to Christian faith, but also for epistemological reasons of our knowledge and thinking. To think at all is always to think of something. The human mind is tied to sensations, images, ideas, that memo from Lenin. Even the idea of evil we conjure up with some construction that we can easily miss for what is actually the case. Given this structure of thinking, that thinking is always about something, and yet Christian theologians want to protect the goodness of creation, evil is only thinkable then in the negation of the good. It violates the usual concepts and categories of thinking. What is more, metaphysical and these epistemological claims about the nature of being and thinking were linked in a specific conception that reaches its high point in the discourse of theodicy. The concern of theodicy is to defend God's goodness in a world that undergoes evil. In the words of Alexander Pope in his essay on man, the task is, quote, to vindicate the ways of God to man. Theodicy then attempted to address the reality of evil under the demands of logical consistency and to avoid contradiction, and thereby to attain a systematic, total perspective on the problem of evil. The project, however, leaves unquestioned its basic assumptions about the nature of thinking itself, namely, the propositional form in which the terms of the problem are expressed and the rule of consistency, which it thought it needed to satisfy the demands of logical argument. But can evil really be captured in logically ordered propositions? That's not all. Much traditional Christian, Jewish, Islamic, and philosophical thought found in suffering an educative motif. That is, suffering, even innocent suffering, teaches us important moral and spiritual lessons. In other words, the traditional conception of theodicy, itself no longer plausible, was linked to a claim about the pedagogical importance of suffering under God's judgment and guidance. But in the wake of the horrors and forms of genocide that riddled the last century and our own, the agenda of theodicy and the claim that God allows suffering in order to teach virtue seems impossible to hold, and in fact may be part of the problem. One reason humanistic approaches to evil bracket metaphysical and theological claims is in order to escape the logic of theodicy, ontotheology, and the belief that suffering teaches virtue. Now, metaphysical claims about being and thinking and arguments about God's goodness are not the only way to try to think about evil. Others have presented anthropological accounts of evil. Immanuel Kant, and before him St. Augustine, explored evil as the inversion of maxims of action, as Kant would put it, or the aversion of the soul's love from God to cling to some other object, as Augustine puts it. Radical evil is the mark by an agent to make something that is known to be wrong or sinful the very principle of her or his actions, the focus of life. Recall Satan's word in Milton's Paradise Lost, "Evil, be thou my good," and then to proclaim it is far better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. In our time, there has also been nuanced psychological inquiries into the lives of evildoers. One psychologist on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, in a wonderful book called A Human Being Died That Night, deals with Eugene de Kock, one of the most brutal apartheid operatives. Was evil intrinsic to de Kock, she asked, and forgiveness therefore wasted on him? And Jonathan Glover, who I've noted before, also probes the psychological dynamics of evildoers. The psychological need on the part of the agent of evil to dehumanize the victim and therefore to sever the social bonds of feeling that bind human beings together. The problem of evil then cuts along these lines: the denial of valid moral constraints and the dehumanization of others. I'm going to pick up on this suggestion for a more empirical approach in terms of various senses that surround our experience of basic goods, and that will provide a way to talk about wicked actions. Now notice, in a brief compass, we've already isolated several ways evil has been considered. Metaphysically, in asking about the connection between thinking, being, and evil. Theologically, in the discourse of theodicy. Through a psychology, or through the psychology of evildoers, and with Kant and Augustine, an anthropological focus on action. Connected to these approaches is the real focus, however, of our concern today in trying to humanize evil. Is evil something that reason can grasp because human action itself is defined in part by reason and its practical judgments? Or is evil something that exceeds reason, even as the moral life is about sensibilities and emotions as well as reason? Starting with the Jewish Holocaust, some thinkers have argued that there are forms of evil that are so depraved that we cannot really understand or explain them. Say naked and battered bodies in an open grave, or the violent and repeated rape of a child, or ethnic cleansing and acts against humanity, or once again, Lenin's memo. The idea here is that if we try to understand and explain such evil, we somehow domesticate it. We make it part of the moral landscape of our own lives, and in this way miss the horror of the victims, what gives us the right to speak for the dead and the abused. Conversely, some other thinkers argue that heinous acts show the banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt famously called them. And further, if we say that evil is unthinkable, then we may fail to grasp the ways that we can and should resist evil. So my task now is to show that some forms of human evil are in fact thinkable, while there are others that are inexplicable. Meaning by that, we cannot grasp rationally their origin or their complete meaning. I'm not addressing what is called natural evil, Hurricane Katrina, for example, or problems of metaphysical evil, that is, whether or not evil is a constitutive part of the structure of reality itself. Put most forcefully, we are trying this afternoon to explore the limits of practical reasoning, that is, reasoning the conduct of life. Richard Kearney comments that, quote, when confronted with evil, we are reminded that there are meanings and experiences that defy the transparency of consciousness and countervene our wills. Oddly, when thinking about evil, we are thinking about the limits of thinking. Images of starved and mangled bodies thrown in a pit at some Nazi concentration camp, or ethnic violence, or Lenin's memo stops the mind in its tract. Even to call these acts evil seems to be just another way of saying, I cannot understand this happening. The last challenge in thinking about evil is then to avoid being reduced to silence when encountering evil actions, persons, events. What concepts are then available to us? Now, interestingly enough, the idea of evil is itself peculiar in this respect. Evil, as some philosophers and theologians call it, is a limit concept. These are curious concepts because they aim to denote and to articulate what exceeds our usual modes of reasoning and our normal moral experience, and yet must connect in some way to thought and experience. And that is why I have to show that evil is thinkable, the wicked, and also inexplicable, depending upon the kind of evil we're looking at, encountering, or planning ourselves. That is, the wicked or the monstrous. So we now have isolated, first, a debate about the validity of theodicy and also the idea that one learns through suffering. Two, another debate about the psychology of evildoers and the nature of human action. And three, a debate related to these first two about whether evil is thinkable or not, but now mindful of the fate of victims. The distinctiveness of the count I want to provide today is to mediate ideas that are too often separated. Specifically, the relation between basic goods, open to careful empirical description, and also an interpretation of conscience. That is, the exploration of conscience as a key to understanding the moral meaning of us being agents in the world. So, in order to show that heinous evil is, oddly enough, both thinkable and yet inexplicable, requires different ways of considering and talking about evil. What do I mean by the terms the wicked and the monstrous? I'll explain these in much greater detail as I go on, but let's have an initial grasp of this. By the wicked, I mean those forms of evil that attack basic goods, as we'll see in a moment. Think of Lenin's memo, or in our time, the Liberian tyrant Charles Taylor, in custody in the Hague for crimes against humanity. During his brutal reign, he used children as soldiers and slaughtered untold numbers of innocent people. This kind of evil is what I am calling the wicked. These acts of evil are thinkable, even if they're heinous, because they aim at the destruction of those goods that human beings need to live and to live well, and which we ourselves sense or experience, and therefore can think about them. The monstrous, on the other hand, is what Kant and others would call radical evil. Recall that for Kant and also St. Augustine, radical evil is when the agent chooses to act on what he or she knows is wrong, is sinful. I'm crafting a limit concept called the monstrous rather than radical evil in order, once again, to humanize evil. Monsters are agents and are deformities of human beings. The monster is a being unmoored from morality and from constitutive relations to and with other human beings. So I aim to outline a position that can retain the distinction, but show the connection between the wicked and the monstrous. That is how I'm going to try to humanize evil, mindful of the many debates about evil in Western thought and theology, which we've just moved through very quickly. Now notice that I've started this lecture on a rather abstract level of getting some clarity about the kinds of concepts we can use to speak about evil, and also the long history of debate about evil. We now turn and take a step closer to the experience of evil, and this will be intensified through the remainder of the lecture. So let's consider wicked actions and basic goods, and so to begin at a more empirical and descriptive plane of things. Okay, Charlottesville's got it. Excuse me for this. Now, in the last few years, there has arisen in ethics renewed concern for various types of basic goods, as they're called. Basic goods, of which there are different kinds, we simply mean by that term those goods without which it is difficult to conceive of human flourishing and well-being. Further, some of those goods are pre-moral in the technical sense, in that they exist independent of our choice, like, say, we have bodies, or that human dependence on parents is extremely long, or that we are social creatures. Other basic goods are distinctly moral in the sense that they rely upon human choice, say, the kinds of relations we forge and foster, what we do with our bodies, what are the forms of meanings that we create in cultures. All of these goods can be articulated without appeal to metaphysical or theological backings, since they are features of human psychological, social, and physical existence. The violation of those goods are harms, which, when intentional, systemic, and extensive, in Lenin's memo, become forms of evil. Now, in my account, there are 4 classes or types of basic goods. We have to go through these to understand the argument. First, worth, a form of goodness, is experienced most basically, sometimes inchoately, in the sense of pleasure and pain that motivates human action. We are drawn to what gives pleasure. We recoil from what gives pain. This is the realm of bodily goods, as I call them. Living beings, that is to say, all creatures situated in life through pleasure and pain, make some claim to be respected and enhanced, even if that claim can, in certain circumstances and for good reasons, be overridden. Bodily goods situate human beings in the world at the most simple level of sensible life, and yet are also linked to other levels of goods that must be properly integrated if life is to continue and to flourish. So there is, second, a distinct realm of social goods. Human beings and the life of many other species are profoundly social. Human existence always and everywhere entails standards, customs, rights, practices, beliefs, which communities develop in order to understand and guide human life. These are social inventions, which guide interactions within the social and natural environments. They include such things as families, economic and political institutions of whatever form, friendships, patterns of interaction with other species, and even the means to think, speak, and to act together. I call these social goods to denote the relation to, and yet distinction from, other kinds of goods. Insofar as social goods must be protected, used, enjoyed, and distributed, then social norms are obviously important. But what is more, as social beings, we are moved by a desire for recognition and are vulnerable to shame. The bonds of our humanity come to rise in a moral sensibility of benevolence for others. But these senses are also open to distortion, like when racist policy breeds shame for one's very being, or sexism fosters the hatred of one's own gender. And benevolence, too, can be stunted or distorted. So I've started to isolate the complexity of attunements to the vitality of life that arise experientially in terms of pleasure and pain, the desire for recognition, and the dynamics of shame. And these are linked to sensibilities for others, that is, sympathy and benevolence. These feelings situate human beings in a world of interlocking goods and evils that surround actions and relations to others. They also demarcate the kind of vulnerability human beings face when we struggle to live and live well, individually and together. But third, people also must take some stance to their bodily and social goods and the motivations that arise from finite social life. Reflective goods satisfy not only the drive for meaning in human life, but also open the possibility of creating new forms and ways of life. Reflective goods denote a posture of interpretation and assessment of bodily and social goods. But they bear worth in of themselves. This level of good aims at truthful life, at meaningfulness, at self-understanding. They are the goods of culture or civilization, the entire domain of symbolic, linguistic, and practical meaning systems. Now, insofar as reflective goods demarcate a range of personal and social meanings, these goods are also linked to the reality of people as individual agents. Pleasure and pain can and do move human beings to act without deliberation. The desire for recognition and the fear of shame can provoke action without questions about the truth of those feelings. Yet human beings are also motivated by the question of the truth of their self-understanding and the values and goals that orient life. At crucial moments in life, the encounter with someone suffering, the joy of a new child, revulsion at gross injustice, one awakens from the habitual and asks about the truth of one's life and what is held to be good and just, benevolent, and forms of sympathy. And this means that a sensibility of justice arises that exceeds sensibility and benevolence. And from this awakening to the moral density of the world arise other feelings that situate human beings in life, the feelings of guilt and innocence. Fourth, human life always takes place in some community, on some bit of earth, and during some time. Bodily, social, and reflective goods are thereby located in time and space. Too often and too readily, the natural and social habitats of humans and non-human forms of life have been ignored. Human life is, in fact, intertwined with the natural goods of locality. The many processes which allow human communities to endure through time and to pass on their ways of life, language, customs, social relations, are now endangered through global processes. The earth is precious, but also endangered. Here we have the natural goods of locality. Our lives are marked by the capacity for empathy. in the face of these vulnerabilities and forms of preciousness. The preciousness of the earth and the vulnerability of human communities as the space of our existence are often sensed in the homelessness people feel when their communities break down or are dislocated. The sense of natural beauty, but also profound terror in the face of the titanic forces of the natural world, also disclose the locality of life. So not only pleasure and pain, recognition and shame, guilt and innocence situate human beings in their world at the level of feelings and moods about the range of goods that saturate life, the locality of natural good, as I'm calling it, arises with feelings of participation or at-homeness and alienation amid the various spaces, natural, social, historical, where human life takes place. The meaning of evil done or suffered is then, in part, demeaning and destroying these four classes of basic goods, as well as, more radically, the destruction of the kind of integration needed in the flourishing of life. Think back to Lenin's memo. He's hitting on all the different levels of these goods, not understanding this, but that in fact is what is going on. So little wonder then that the most heinous forms of evil, fascism, genocide, sexual abuse, aim to destroy these goods and their integration in a human life. It is on this level of reflection to dehumanize the victim through the destruction of the goods needed in some measure to live a recognizably human life. It is then a violation of the imperative of responsibility that is to respect and enhance the integrity of life. The account I have given indicates from a humanistic perspective one kind of evil. The evil done or suffered to the basic goods of human life. And it also allows us to get at features of, standard features of evil actions. As John Peters notes, quote, evil action consists in the combination of three components: benevolent motivation of the evildoers, the serious excessive harm caused by their action, and the lack of morally acceptable excuses for those actions. We can unfold the account of basic goods that I have just given you to understand excessive harm, and also to isolate some of what might count as morally acceptable excuses or reprimands for harmful actions. And it would also be possible to explore the linguistic and symbolic forms, like lament or mourning, and also the symbolism of evil. But rather than pursuing those issues, we need to pick up on one component of the problem of evil, that is malevolent motivation. And so to turn to the second humanistic concern about the self, and probe deeper the problem of evil. So far, we've isolated the category of the wicked as a thinkable reality in light of the basic goods we all need, and we know others need, in whatever form they take, to sustain recognizably human lives. In this respect, evil is thinkable, and it is wicked. While there is no doubt social conditions that create the reality and spread of evil, it is also the case that evil arises within us. And now we have to turn closer to our own experiences of the world. Now it's important to note that in the account of basic goods I've just given, there is an inherent complexity, but also instability in human existence. At each point there is, at the level of felt needs, a tension within each kind of basic goods. And so, say, a tension between pleasure and pain and bodily goods. There's tensions between goods. And so the tension of whether the reflective good felt in the claim of justice can conflict with the bonds of sympathy or benevolence. Human beings are complex, but also unstable beings. This is, in part, the roots of evil. This does not mean, I think, that there is a propensity or inclination towards evil, even if we should not imagine that we can easily eradicate its sources in us, as Reinhold Niebuhr would insist. Rather, there is, in my judgment, an instability in human existence that can be the occasion for evil action. How then to speak about this essential instability and thus the vulnerability and fallibility of human beings? Various strategies have been taken. Locating this instability in reason itself. And so the possibility of the inversion of maxims, as Emmanuel Kant put it, and I noted before. It might be located at the level of our loves, as St. Augustine's analysis of the aversio from God as a kind of deficient causality rooted in misdirected love. Or following Paul Ricoeur, we might isolate evil, this kind of evil, not in reason or not in love, but in will, and thus the fact that human beings mediate biology and rationality. We are beings towards death, and yet we can imagine things beyond death. Now, the difficulty with these famous strategies used to speak about radical evil, that is, the discourses of reason, will, and feeling, is that, at least in my judgment, they leave open the very issue we are trying to articulate, namely, the connection between the instability within our lives and the moral determination of kinds of goods needed to make sense of the meaning of evil, at least from a humanistic perspective. It's how do we connect self-consciousness with our lives being permeated through these different levels of goods and the instability within each of them. We need a concept or a symbol, a limit concept, that bridges self-consciousness and the accounts of goods in order to make sense of malevolent motivation. And here's where I judge we need to reclaim and rehabilitate the idea of conscience as a term for the moral labor of human being. Conscience in the history of thought has been symbolized as the voice of the other, to respect their dignity, or the claims of God on the self, to relieve suffering of others, and therefore to be the aim or end of moral subjectivity, that is, to lead a responsible life with and for others. And it is claiming that in conscience, the demand of responsibility is experienced with the very origin of our subjectivity. Conscience is to know oneself with conscientia, to know oneself with the claims of the goods we have just noted, and thus the possibility of the lament of the sufferer. It is the call amid the instability of the self to respect and enhance the integrity of life. Conscience, then, is not simply Freud's conception of the superego that punishes us for our wrongdoings and excites the experience of guilt. It is not just the internalization of social mores that might give rise to guilt or shame, although these are all important psychological and social dynamics which we've isolated in terms of the levels of goods we live through. Rather, conscience is a concept symbol for the objective demands of the responsible life, perceivable in and through our own self-interpretations of our lives. Conscience bridges, mediates, objective demands arising out of the levels of goods we've uncovered and excavated with our inmost felt integrative free struggle that defines a human life. So the picture of the self that I'm developing here, and why I began with the excavation of kinds of basic goods to make sense of wickedness, the picture I'm making of a human being here is a complex, multidimensional, and yet free being. Freedom, as the British philosopher Mary Midgley has noted, quote, centers on being a creature able in some degree to act as a whole in dealing with its conflicting desires. Though it is only an endeavor, though the wholeness is
ready-made and can never be fully achieved, yet the integrative struggle to heal conflicts and to reach towards this wholeness is surely the core of what we mean by human freedom. The self is a dynamic, tensive reality seeking to integrate itself with respect to internal conflicts, with respect to the desires and social forces that we've tried to excavate, and which must be integrated or our lives come to an end. Conscience is the felt awareness of the integrated struggle of freedom, a felt awareness that is indexed both to the instability within our own lives and the complexity and conflicts of desires we've isolated with respect to the range of basic goods that must be integrated if life is to continue, let alone to flourish. So beyond evil as the destruction of basic goods, wickedness, evil from this perspective is also, and more radically, the denial of the claim of conscience. It is the destruction of the origin of moral subjectivity through the unjust demeaning and destroying of others' lives, or in the systematic attempt to destroy the integrative struggle of freedom in human beings. The term conscience designates the paradoxical claim that the origin of consciousness, that is our ongoing self-interpretation, is disclosed and constituted with the aim of moral action, that is, responsibly to respect and enhance the integrity of life and the grace this entails. The idea of conscience lets us think and articulate the origin of our sense of self, but under the moral demand of the integrity of life. And this means that evil, humanistically understood, is most deeply and radically the violation and betrayal of conscience. It is to sever the connection between objective moral demands arising out of the level of goods and the personal self-interpretation and integration, and thereby to destroy distinctively human forms of freedom found in the integrative struggle of each and every human life. From this perspective, the reality of evil as the betrayal of conscience is the eruption of the monstrous in human form. By this I mean both the concealment of evil, because the monstrous meets us in all too human form, its banality and fault and suffering, but also that evil actions bring into reality powers which sever the connection between objective demands and the basic goods, and one's own and others, and also the social bond from our own innermost self-interpretations. Evil action, as the monstrous in human form, is, we might say, the terrifying ascent of a human being beyond good and evil, and a horrific descent of a social being into isolation and the abyss of aloneness. In this respect, interestingly enough, the story of Adam and Eve, the Adamic myth, is right, at least in this respect. Monstrous evil is the ascent to knowledge and power beyond itself, which then drives human beings out of their given condition, the so-called fall. And if that's true, it means paradoxically that we might need religious myths and symbols in order to sustain a humanistic ethics. And also, metaphysically speaking, note that we need to grant the reality of freedom in the world. So by starting with a humanistic account of evil, and bracketing religious and metaphysical claims, we are led into religious discourse and some metaphysical assumptions in order to articulate the proper limits of a humanistic ethics. And let me now conclude with some brief comments on that point. I have made this argument for the humanism of evil without appeal initially to the logic of theodicy, claim to follow God's wheel, or appeal to metaphysical backings of the reality of the good. I have isolated the interrelation of two kinds of evil that arise because of the complexity and instability of human beings, that is, the wicked and the monstrous. Each of these kinds of evil has three components, as already noted: malevolent motivation, excessive harm, and lack of moral excuse. Yet the purpose of each is different. The wicked is aimed at the goods of life. The monstrous attacks the integrity of existence through the destruction of conscience. Not all monstrous acts are wicked. They might be aimed solely at the conscience of self or others. Not all wicked actions are monstrous. And this is to agree in part with Mary Midgley when she notes that a great deal of evil is caused by quite respectable and unaggressive motives like sloth, fear, avarice, and greed. But it is also to insist that aside from the wicked, there is also monstrous forms of evil aimed at destroying conscience itself through an ascent beyond the human condition that severs human social bonds. Now, aside from isolating kinds of evil, we have also ironically been led from within a humanistic perspective to challenge the brackets that many humanists, Glover, Mitchell, put on our thinking. That is the case because I've isolated what we can call a metaphysical assumption in this argument, namely that freedom exists, and that it is the work of the whole self on the whole self to respond to conflicts and instabilities within the self's experience and its society. Further, in order to articulate the meaning of the monstrous, as the violation of conscience, I have gestured towards the use of religious myths, noting, for instance, the myth of the fall as both a hubristic violation of the locality of human freedom on earth, and thus violating reflexive and natural goods, which is also a descent into isolation and non-humanity, thereby violating bodily and social goods. Adam and Eve reach for a knowledge beyond their power, and yet in doing so instantiate their alienation from each other, from their sense of self, from their bodies, from their home, their locality. The argument has been unfolded within what I have called theological humanism, a position I've rather tried to enact in this lecture than to explain or defend. Well, what has linked all these moves, that is the metaphysical assumption, the use of religious myth within a conception, an expanded conception of humanism that can isolate two forms of evil, what has linked all of that has been this discourse of conscience as the symbol concept for connecting the chaos and creation in the world with the chaos and creation in our own lives. And this means to conclude that challenging evil is just that. It's an ongoing struggle. Yet the idea of spiritual struggle is not a strange one for humanists. Whether religious or not, humanists have always understood that the real war of human existence is the constant and unending struggle to live by our greatest ideals and our own most dignity, rather than to follow the seductions of power, the desires and gods that demean the human soul. The spiritual battle is to counter those forces of degradation and thereby to respect and enhance the integrity of human and non-human life. The work of conscience, at its deepest, is the struggle against forms of human evil for the sake of a humane future. Thank you very much.